Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us on what has turned out to be the second heatwave edition of the year. It's June 2026. Hopefully, we won't have a third one. Um, so, thank you for joining us on a very hot evening. I think this is a very good place to be, short of actually being able to visit a castle and find the cellars somewhere. That would be very cool indeed. So we are joined today by Emma Fearon of Nottingham Trent University, talking about presentation of history at castles. So that'll be a very interesting topic indeed. And especially thank you very much, Emma, for joining us, not just in the middle of a heat wave, but days before your Viva as well. So a busy period. I hope this will be some useful preparation to think about the topic and just get back into gear. And good luck with the Viva next week. So I think that takes care of the housekeeping. There'll be a couple of announcements at the end. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our speaker. Thank you very much, Emma.
Thanks, Richard. I just want to say thank you to Richard and the Castle Studies Group in general for inviting me today. And also a happy Pride Month. I think we kind of realised that it was a happy coincidence that this talk has happened in June. So that was quite a nice coincidence for me as well. So a little bit about me to start. I'm funded by Midlands Four Cities, and I was previously on a collaborative doctoral award with Nottingham Castle prior to its liquidation in November 2022. So my thesis is entitled Opening the Gates, Increasing Opportunities for the Representation of Gender and LGBTQI+ in Castle Histories. And it explores how we can find and interpret gender and LGBTQI+ stories at castle sites and how these stories can be presented to visitors. So as said, I've recently submitted and my Viva is next week. So I'm hoping that this is kind of going to be good preparation for that. So here, I'm going to kind of start with a quick overview of kind of what this paper will explore. So the paper will explore how we can find and interpret objects of queer significance at castle sites. It will provide a brief overview of my thesis and then look at comparison of 9 castle sites across the UK to consider how queer stories are already being portrayed. Then the paper will explore 2 theories which underpin the methodologies of the practice-based research undertaken at Nottingham Castle. And finally, it will explore the 2 projects which showcase queer stories to the public at the Nottingham Castle site. So, as a research overview, the project was originally in collaboration with Nottingham Castle Trust. So after the Trust's liquidation in November 2022, my collaborative doctoral award was dissolved, but I've maintained links with the site since they reopened in 2023, and this included completing a placement with them in 2024. So it's important to note that I'm not a spokesperson or associate of Nottingham Castle, but much of what will be discussed today does relate to the placements and projects that I have completed with the site, both before and after the liquidation of the Trust. So my research crosses this divide between museum and castle studies and uses both gender and queer theory to discover ways of presenting LGBTQI+ histories to visitors. So Nottingham Castle is a heritage site situated within the city centre of Nottingham. The castle's moniker pays homage to the original Norman castle built on the site where the ducal mansion now stands. The site's main building is the ducal mansion, originally built by William Cavendish, Duke of Newcastle in 1674 and renovated in 1878 after rioters burnt the building down in 1831. The renovation transformed the site into an art gallery and museum, which remains the site's main function today. Nottingham Castle closed in 2018 to undergo a £30 million renovation and reopened in June 2021. For context, my thesis ended up starting in the September of the same year as well. So I went into my thesis with the castle reopening. But then unfortunately, the site did go into liquidation in November 2022. So it's been quite a turbulent kind of 5 years. And then reopened in summer 2023. And it's now no longer managed by the Trust. That has been dissolved and it is managed by Nottingham City Council. So queer history at castle sites remains an undeveloped area of research, as many sites just choose to focus on the medieval facade and the military achievements of the site. The militaristic and medieval focus can lend itself to a patriarchal view of the past, where masculine prowess is on display. visiting many castle sites today, it is easy to forget that these sites have had a place within the landscape for centuries and represent history of the last several centuries too. So in recent years, LGBTQI plus histories are increasingly on the agenda for heritage sites, with events displaying queer stories typically being showcased in February for LGBTQI plus History Month or June for Pride. So from May 2022 to March 2023, site visits were undertaken to 9 castle sites within the UK to establish how gendered and LGBTQI plus stories are communicated or silenced within existing castle narratives. So these site visits were completed using funding from the Midlands Four Cities Research Development Fund, and the 9 sites chosen were Newark, Norwich, Colchester and Kenilworth Castles, the Tower of London, Edinburgh Castle, Tamworth Castle, Lincoln Castle and Lancaster Castle. They were selected as they represent a cross-section of urban castle sites across the UK with attributes comparable to Nottingham Castle. It was also important for me to pick 9 as a kind of case study like this. It hadn't really been done before, so it was kind of integral for me to go and see as many as possible. So Newark Castle, Tamworth Castle and Kenilworth Castle are in the Midlands, marking them geographically close to Nottingham Castle and kind of would have the same or like similar kind of geographical visitor demographic. Norwich Castle, Lincoln Castle and Lancaster Castle represent non-traditional castle sites, having been adapted for other uses like prisons. So there's potentially some kind of queer stories to tell there. In contrast, Colchester Castle, the Tower of London and Edinburgh Castle are examples of more traditional urban castles that align with typical expectations of castle architecture and function as castle museums. Following site selection, each visit was analysed using structured framework to assess how interpretation practices engage with or overlook gendered and LGBTQI plus histories. So the sites were analysed using application of critical museum visitor theory proposed by Margaret Linauer. So Linauer's framework was particularly suited to this study as it encourages critical engagement with both the physical and discursive elements of museum interpretation, allowing for a nuanced analysis of inclusion and exclusion within heritage narratives. Linauer's theory involves taking notes both pre and post visit and using a critical perspective to analyse exhibition display. So part of the analysis is you have to kind of do a little bit of research and kind of ruminate on your own thinking about these sites before you go. So you might have personal experience. I know for me, I'd been to Lincoln Castle before at a graduation event for a friend. So that was kind of a pre-existing like notion that I brought to that. So it's those types of experience. It's also kind of looking at the websites, any brochures that you see online. You kind of use those notes as well as the analysis when you get on site and kind of see the site and its interpretation itself. So there's kind of many takeaways from this research. We'll kind of summarize a few of them right now. So the key takeaways from these site visits were that permanent display of LGBTQI plus stories were few. So none of the sites visited had explicit display of queer stories or interpretation. That's not to say that they don't now, because at least I would say 4 of these sites have kind of had some kind of restoration or kind of new interpretation display put in. So the Tower of London has a new medieval exhibit. Not a lot of Norwich Castle was closed when I was there as well, because the kind of Norman Keep was closed and was being refurbished, and that's now open as well. Areas of Newark Castle have been shut down and is going to kind of reopen in the next couple of years with Heritage Lottery funding as well. So kind of the insights I have right now can be subject to change, but these were kind of the observations of the time. But yeah, kind of like at the time, there just wasn't explicit queer stories on display. But that's not to say that kind of these castles didn't have other forms of really good display. So Colchester Castle, Kenilworth Castle and Tower of London did have excellent display of these stories online, but that just wasn't, kind of integrated and embedded on site. So the site visits also demonstrated how creative practice could enhance diverse stories. In particular, the use of the Tamworth AR Explorer used AR on the user's personal mobile device to layer objects and stories of individuals on site through the phone screen. This was particularly effective for introducing stories of servants who worked at the site, for whom little evidence had remained. Another takeaway was the financial burden of alternative stories. So the Tower of London's multimedia tour, which was available for an additional fee, contained an additional 40-minute tour, which could be listened to anywhere on site, called Alternative Tales from the Tower. So when I went, it was a very hot day, and I just kind of sat in the main courtyard and kind of listened to the story like on my headphones, and kind of took in this kind of tale while I was on site. So this narrative called Alternative Tales from the Tower involves stories, poetry, and interviews from young people within London who retold histories from the tower's past. The style of this interpretation really contrasted with the other tracks within the scripted audio guide, with tracks taking the form of rap, poetry, and the use of local London dialects as well. So this placement of alternative tales behind the paywall does kind of reflect a broader trend in heritage interpretation, where marginalised narratives are treated as supplementary rather than integral to the on-site narratives. It also demonstrated that financial constraints could kind of physically affect the route taken by the visitor through the castle site as well. So both the Tower of London and Colchester Castle used additional paid multimedia materials to introduce routes through the site. And that could affect the route that the visitors chose as well if they chose not to pay this fee. So I know for me personally, I didn't pay for the multimedia tool at Colchester Castle. And then that meant I accidentally kind of took almost like a backwards route through the site, and kind of didn't realise I'd done that route, and I kind of viewed everything out of sync, which kind of was quite interesting for my experience and kind of like how I saw the histories, but it certainly wasn't the route that the institution wanted me to take. So because of this kind of paywall, that could mean potentially missing out on narratives within the heritage space as well, or kind of stories that they would like to be spotlighted. An example at Nottingham Castle, actually, prior to the liquidation, when it was managed by the Trust, was that the Robin Hood Adventures Gallery was an additional paid £3 fee. And originally they wanted you to kind of come into the castle through this gallery space, but most people weren't willing to pay that £3 fee. So they came into the castle through a different entrance route, missed the exhibition, then missed the historical exhibition that was after it. And in order to get back to those kind of the historical exhibition, which was called the Rebellion Gallery, they had to kind of almost kind of go circulate back and like go back on themselves. And it was a little bit of an odd route. And many of them, ended up missing this exhibition. And for a lot of them, they did come to see like the history of the site. So it did leave many of the visitors feeling disappointed that there wasn't enough historical interpretation. So these routes and kind of, if there's paywalls, can have, an effect not just on diverse stories, but on that kind of general route and other interpretation as well at the site. So kind of overall, this shows that the site visits demonstrated the importance of permanent on-site narratives for the marginalised stories, and ensuring that marginalised stories are free and accessible to visits, and that creative practice could offer innovative solutions to scarce evidence. So my thesis includes two kind of big theory chapters that underpin all of the kind of practice-based research that comes after. So the first of these theory chapters was the castle and the city. So upon entering the city of Nottingham, the modern visitor is inundated with guidance on how to arrive at Nottingham Castle. From banners along major roadways to waypoint signs, the presence of the castle permeates the city. Since its inception, the castle has held a commanding presence over the city of Nottingham. Geographically, the site is situated upon Castle Rock, a domineering 113-foot cliff face. The Castle Rock offered a naturally defensive location from which the surrounding area developed into the fortified town and administrative centre of Nottingham during the 10th century. Since its development, the castle and the city of Nottingham have been ideologically and physically connected. The ideological aspects of this connection come through its nomenclature, while its physical location within the Nottingham city centre adds to its visibility. So Laura Jane Smith demonstrates that heritage is constructed in relation to authorised heritage discourse, also called AHD. So AHD is a framework which describes how heritage is constructed in relation to Western, white and middle upper class identity. It privileges material objects and aesthetics in an aim to preserve this material culture, which is sanctioned through the role of the expert. It achieves this through creating a common sense of identity. So what this means is AHD kind of privileges sites that are kind of managed by institutions, like the experts or the people sanctioned by the institution, so they could be academics. And there's a kind of, when it creates this feeling of common sense of identity, it's often in relation to nationhood and kind of civic identity. There's an aim of like stasis and preservation, and a sense that we're kind of conserving these places for the future as well. So there's a real static feeling to kind of this construction of heritage. And kind of Laura Jane Smith analyses country houses to come to this conclusion as well. So to AHD, whether subconsciously or otherwise, my thesis argues that heritage is culturally constructed and legitimised through various modes of encounter. So these modes of encounter highlight the active nature and doing of heritage, which Smith describes. So in my chapter, I explored 3 modes of encounter between the castle and the city, which is ideological, authority, and the visual. So ideological includes the symbolic connections between the castle and the city, which might include conceptions of nationhood, personal identity, civic identity. Authority relates to both municipal and lordly encounter, as castle sites, as we all know, contain signifiers of this kind of authoritative encounter. So that could be the heraldic symbols that relate to ownership, or the kind of literal kind of control of the gate and access to the site, often by a local council or body such as English Heritage National Trust. Visual encounter relates to the facade of the castle and its position within the cityscape. So, particularly in the case of Nottingham Castle, it's a high vantage point. It feels connected to the city because you can quite literally see it in the cityscape as well. You can see it when you come in on the train. So analysis of brochures and websites of the 9 castle sites and comparison to Nottingham Castle demonstrate this implicit connection between urban castles and the surrounding city. So within the brochures, there was often a map of the surrounding city as well, situating the site in context to kind of other sites of significance within the cityscape. And marketing of Nottingham Castle does explicitly show how these 3 modes of encounter intersect. So you can kind of see them on the screen. So there's Wayfair signs. This banner is outside of the train station, which it's kind of visually showing pictures of the castle before you can even see it in person. And this one here is when you come off the train, before you even get through the ticket barriers to get into the city centre, you're almost kind of like invited to come into the castle grounds, which I quite like, through this path here, and that actually leads towards the side entrance of the castle. And I think that one's particularly interesting, because it kind of shows how the castle is inherently part of Nottingham as a city and like has that explicit relationship as well. So an example from this to kind of show this kind of method of encounter further is the kind of banner of this aerial image here. So I'll just kind of move my face across the screen. So this one here. So the viewer is invited to kind of visit the site through the statement, pay once, visit all year. The branding of the site is depicted, the green and yellow colour scheme, an image of Robin Hood and this TT design, which is this. And then Sear Genius, the company responsible for designing this logo, indicates that the design has multiple meanings. So the company states, immediately the eye catches the repeated cross shapes cleverly forming the distinctive TT characters of the word Nottingham. Furthermore, the recognition of arrow slits, once utilised by archers on the castle's battlement towers, adds a historical depth to the design. As you delve deeper into the logo, various secondary and tertiary shapes emerge, each conjuring different thoughts and emotions. Crosses, trees representing the forest, and swords come to mind, culminating in a powerful visual narrative. Upon contemplation, the design gradually reveals the intricate details of a sword, complete with its pommel, grip, and hilt, held firmly by a determined hand ready for battle. I think that's a lot packed into a small logo that has the 2 T's in Nottingham. So this TT logo itself is a site of encounter, reflecting the architectural aspects of the castle within the name of Nottingham itself. There is further spatial encounter between Nottingham Castle and Sherwood Forest within the TT logo through the imagery of the trees. Coupled with the Robin Hood logo, this spatial encounter becomes more prevalent. And this is kind of called upon further with Nottinghamshire County Council aligning its branding with the Robin Hood legend, incorporating the major oak and the colour green into its official visual identity. Nottingham City Council also encourages further visual identification, with the colour green associated with the branding of Nottingham Castle and throughout the city on banners and in the design of the Robin Hood Network transportation pass. So the location of Nottingham Castle banners outside of Nottingham Station do signify a relationship between the castle and the city of Nottingham. The banners demonstrate encounter with authority as they are authorised by Nottingham City Council. The imagery of the castle and the logo create a mode of visual encounter with the Nottingham Castle site, reinforcing this image of the castle within the cityscape as well. And the shared signifier of Robin Hood between the castle and the city further represents a moment of ideological encounter between the castle and the city of Nottingham. So recognising these connections and flexible boundaries between the castle and the city can expand the types of stories that we can tell. So that's how I used it to kind of talk about queer stories, which I'll expand upon in the practice-based chapters. But essentially aligning the castle with the city and thinking about kind of the boundaries of a castle more flexibly will allow us to look beyond the castle walls to enhance these stories within. So my other theories were on kind of queer time and effective encounter. So theories of queer time question the ways in which heteronormativity frames and disciplines time. It calls for a reconsideration of how cultural expectations of maturation, so that's marriage, children, etc., are defined and produced. Queer time is usually explored through a sociological or contemporary history lens, with culture and societal expectations being scrutinised and redefined. Halberstam describes queer time and space as developing in opposition to family, heterosexuality, and reproduction. They argue that homosexuality has the potential to open up new life narratives and alternative relations to time and space. Dinshaw is one of few historians who examines queer temporality in relation to the medieval world. They theorise that queerness has this temporal dimension and focuses on the asynchrony of time, specifically the multiplicities contained within the now. Dinshaw argues that the past allows the possibility of touching across time through effective contact between marginalised people now and then. So it's this idea of resonance across time. So queer theory can have interesting ramifications for heritage sites. So if heterosexual time is neat and linear, documenting life from conception through to marriage, children, death, then homosexual time is messy and multiplicitous, free from the constraints of social convention and expectation. We can map this analogy onto the temporality of heritage sites. So when you arrive at the castle site, you are often greeted with a timeline of the history of the site. So for some sites, the entire castle visitor route may become mapped out in this way. This means that the history of the site that is communicated may be reduced to the key historical events that can be mapped onto the timeline. For example, battle dates, sieges, and kingly visits. This reduces the history of the castle often to a patriarchal and militaristic lens. Gendered and queer histories may become mapped onto this existing timeline, but they're often overshadowed by this kind of key dates theme that linger as focus points for the visitor viewing. So if we view objects, histories, and stories as artifacts that can induce a contact point through time, it warps time and forces the visitor to think outside of the chronology. This is helpful when we recognise the multiple ongoing and competing narratives that exist within the artifact, which may not conform to a heterosexual imagining of the castle site, and it allows us to think of the competing layers of historical time. So while a timeline can be useful for kind of framing history, sometimes it's not always useful for thinking about alternative stories, and it's kind of this kind of key dates thing kind of conforms to that idea of the AHD that we talked about earlier, with kind of time being static and the place being this kind of almost static as well. And you can kind of reduce it to these key moments rather than kind of fluid and more conceptual. So from March to September 2024, I was on placement at Nottingham Castle, researching queer stories within their collection. And Nottingham Castle's collection is largely devoted to items received from 1878 after becoming the first municipal art museum in the country. It does retain some items donated from the city residents, and there is a doorway of carved oak which is believed to be dated to the Elizabethan era. It was formerly situated on Bottle Lane in Nottingham at a premise known locally as King John's Palace. The doorway features two carved figures with male faces and breasts, and the carving on the spandrel is more difficult to discern. I think it could be a mermaid, so that's one here. That's one interpretation, although I'm sure people have kind of others as well. So Reverend Orange's 1840 historical text associates the site to the former court of King John, and the document recounts how the local butcher resides in the building where the doorway is installed, claims the site to be locally known as King John's Palace. Although this is different, it's not the King John's Palace in Clipstone in northwest Nottinghamshire, so it's still a little bit unclear as to where the exact location of the doorway was. But eventually it was kind of removed and installed in Nottingham Castle pre the restoration, and it was in between two historical exhibits. So when it was stored here, it did not feature as an object on display, and many staff members today didn't even realise it was one of the artefacts as part of the collection. They just thought it was kind of decorative between these two exhibitions. But when the castle reopened in 2021, it was removed, and so the picture you can see on the left is how it's housed in the stores at the moment. So what's important is that there's a drawing of the door frame featured in Reverend Orange's 1840 book, The History and Antiquities of Nottingham. And in this drawing, the following description, the figures are feminized, being described as grotesque female figures resembling the Egyptian Sphinx. So without the preservation of the door frame in the castle's collection, the masculine elements of the carving may have been erased from history. So looking at the carvings and the drawing and the information provided by Reverend Orange, how does the door frame make you feel? Do you feel surprised, affirmed, intrigued? What is your interpretation of the figures? Why do you think they're both masculine and feminine? And do you also think they're Egyptian sphinxes, or do you think there's something else? Does your prior knowledge or experiences affect how you view the carvings? So all these questions are a form of affective encounter. So for me, the carvings just feel inherently queer, particularly because it's kind of bearded nature of them with the breasts. There's almost, because of the liminal space of the doorway, speaks to this element of transness within the carvings, as these are bodies on display which are in a state of transformation. They contain multiplicities which do not conform to gendered expectation. But Reverend Orange's feminization of the carvings, so that's this here, through his drawings and the text, also have resonances with queer historical experience, as it is a stark reminder of the erasure of queer history from the historical record, but it also speaks to our current political situation and the misgendering faced by trans people in the UK today. So to view this carving today is to collapse time and ruminate on competing layers of history. The intention of these carvings was probably not to speak to queer experiences, but through emotion and empathy and affective encounter, the modern viewer can find these resonances when they reach through time. So through these resonances, visitor satisfaction may be achieved through an introspective experience that creates a sense of belonging and affinity to the past. So my kind of question around this is kind of what impact can emotions have on our understanding of historical artifacts? And can these emotions and personal experiences bridge the gap between the past and present to bring forth a new queer understanding? And I kind of hope to answer that within the practice-based research. So the first of these two practice-based research was the Souls performances. I don't have time today, but usually when I talk about this, I show a video. So you can scan the QR code or just kind of put in Souls Performance Nottingham into YouTube. It'll come up. It'll talk about the process from the actors and the designers of how they came up with these characters. And I think it adds a real interesting layer of interpretation. So on the 23rd of April 2022, Souls was performed at Nottingham Castle. 4 roaming tours led visitors across the castle site to visit 5 LGBTQI+ characters whose lives were connected to the castle or city of Nottingham. The project was a collaboration between students and staff within Nottingham Trent University's School of Art and Design, School of Art and Humanities, Nottingham Castle, and actors from the Nottinghamshire LGBTQI+ community. The project was overseen by Dr. Andrea Montoya of the School of Art and Design, with students from the school designing and devising costumes and stories for the chosen characters. Historical research was explored by myself, which involved researching queer figures and events connected to Nottingham and presenting them to the students. The students were not limited to the selected figures and were encouraged to pursue their own research around the topic. So the 5 selected characters were Edward II, Margaret Cavendish, Hercules, Sir William Neville, and Ursula from D.H. Lawrence's The Rainbow. Part of the reason why these were chosen, they all had a connection to either the site or Nottingham. So Edward II has explicit links through the cave system, as that's where Queen Isabella was found with Roger Mortimer. Margaret Cavendish was kind of this prolific author, and she was gender non-conforming, and her husband was William Cavendish, who built the new ducal palace. Hercules might seem unusual, but there is a painting of Hercules in the Long Gallery, and the student Ivy, who did this one, was trans and really kind of resonated with the story of Hercules kind of dressing up in women's clothing. So William Neville is the story of the gay knights at Nottingham Castle, if you've heard of that. They were kind of they're buried. Oh, where were they buried? I forgot. I think it was Istanbul, and their grave was found, and the grave suggests that there was some kind of bonded marriage bond between the two. And then Ursula is a character in D.H. Lawrence's The Rainbow. D.H. Lawrence is from Nottingham, so there's that connection there. So the characters were performed by members of the local LGBTQI+ community after an open call for queer actors was advertised. A leaflet outlining the roaming tour route and biographies for the characters was devised and distributed to audience members at the ticket desk prior to the start of the performances. So this was kind of led by a practice-led research approach. They chose, these stories from a variety of sources: literature, pamphlets, paintings. One of the things that wasn't picked was there was an event called Pink Lace, which was the second and third ever Nottingham Pride was held at the castle. I think it was in 98 and 99. They could have created their own story based on that, for example. So there was plenty of scope for the students to pick what they wanted. And the performances were integrated in this space, incorporating roaming theatre and collective walking practices. So it sought to kind of measure the impact of research-led site-specific performance at Nottingham Castle. And eventually we did questionnaires to kind of find out these rules from the audience members, and all of this was published in the International Journal of Heritage Studies as well. So you can kind of see that more in depth within that journal. So the outcomes were measured by the questionnaire, and they underwent a semantic analysis and qualitative coding process, and this revealed 4 themes. So that was emotional, environmental, educational, and performative impact. And these themes reveal how collaboration was essential in promoting queer histories. So environmental impact revealed that the environs of Nottingham Castle had an impact on the experience of the audience members. So visitors described the performances as enhancing the site, with collective walking offering a way to discover the castle. And at the time of the performance, Nottingham Castle did not offer a guided tour of the castle grounds, with the exception being a tour of the caves bought for an extra fee. So it really covered that gap as well. And then the use of collective walking in the performance, the act of physically moving from one performance space to another, served to fulfill an educational gap. It highlighted the castle as a sixth performer, omnipresent in the space that the visitors walked through and the actors performed in. We were occasionally reminded of the kind of presence of other people within the tour as well, of other visitors, who made noise, and that kind of added to this experience and the sense of the castle as a kind of performer as well. More importantly, 86% of respondents indicated that they agreed or strongly agreed that the performances enhanced their experiences of the Nottingham Castle grounds, and they really requested for more live performances of this nature as well. So it really shows it was well received. Educationally, visitors really noted the educational value of the performances. Many requested additional literature. I think a lot of them missed it on the way in. But it was really positive to see that there was this enthusiasm. They wanted to know more about these characters, because it showed that they really believed in the authenticity of the characters to this space, and that by bringing these stories that were outside the castle grounds into the space was really effective, and they did believe in it. They just wanted to learn more. And the visitors really reflected on how they learnt about real LGBTQ history, despite the event being creative performance. And Nottingham Castle is known for visitor complaints about the status kind of not being a castle, because it doesn't really kind of look like one. So they kind of really liked having that historical perspective as well. So creative performance and creative lighting acted not as a barrier, but as a stepping stone on which visitors could perceive queer history. Emotionally, this was really important. There was really strong emotional performances, particularly to this one, which they all called the Rainbow performance. This was the Ursula one from D.H. Lawrence's The Rainbow. They thought it was moving and a tearjerker. the character in this was not wheelchair bound, but the costume was made around the character, and that had a huge emotional impact. Many kind of gasped when she kind of turned around on the wheelchair, and it just really seemed to connect and resonate with the performances. Emotion and memory are profoundly interlinked. Therefore, these positive memories in connection with empathy could translate to future revisits as well. And finally, the performance. So the inclusion of the students was essential to the creativity of the performances. Audience members indicated their enjoyment of the variety of stories on display and the inclusive nature of the performances. And by working on scripts, costumes, and directing and in heritage, the students responded to a variety of mediums and kind of really helped them with their university studies as well. I know one of them, after graduating, did decide to pursue an MA in Heritage Studies at NTU as well. So there was a pedagogical aspect to the performances in addition. So the use of creative practice offers a novel way of penetrating and presenting the layers of history embedded within the castle site. And creative license is also a use of tool for portraying queer histories, as the lack of documentary sources becomes less of a barrier. So creative practice allows for concepts of authenticity and imagination to collide, with the Souls Project illustrating how queer history can enhance the visitor experience. And finally, I'm tight for time, so I'll kind of go through this as quickly as I can. But we have the final practice-based research, and that was the 2024 Nottingham Castle's LGBTQI+ Lives and Lovers audio tour. So from March to September 2024, I undertook a part-time placement at Nottingham Castle. This involved developing the walking audio tour entitled Above, and this was uploaded to the Bloomberg Connects app. And this audio tour follows the stories of 4 paintings within the Long Gallery, which all contain LGBTQI+ themes related to the artist or story within. So it was held in the Long Gallery and as an art tour, because the history talks were typically an additional extra and paid extra. As I said earlier, from a research, this was not something I was willing to do. So we had to focus on the Long Gallery instead, as these tended to be free and part of the core offering of the ticket. And Bloomberg Connects app also allows the stories to be accessed off-site as well, which will increase the readership and be more inclusive in that way. So the objects were chosen using the theories presented above. So the Hercules one and the hibiscus flower one were both centered on queer feeling. So the Hercules one related to the Souls Project. Because of the liquidation, all the staff were replaced and they were made redundant. So most of the on-site staff did not know what the Souls Project was, even though it had only taken place 2 years before. So including that, narrative allowed it to come back into the castle as well. And then the hibiscus flower, which I'll talk on again in a moment, was really based on queer feeling. People felt there was a queer resonance with this, and that's what prompted the research. These two were based on expanding castle boundaries. So the Lovers' Bowl was commissioned for Nottingham Castle, and it kind of became rediscovered as it was at Newstead Abbey and then got brought over. And then this one was chosen. It's about the relationship between Charles Shannon and Charles Ricketts. And that was based through talking to former members of staff. So there was a reconnection with those as well. So there was this rediscovery of LGBT stories. The Lovers' Bowl, feel free to ask me that in the questions, because I've run out of time to talk about it. That was particularly interesting and related to former staff members. But I think this one was kind of really important to talk about in terms of confidence. So the hibiscus flower painting, there was a lack of confidence around this, and this is shown in the on-site interpretation. So after the castle reopened in 2022, explicit references to the suggestion that Rankin was homosexual was removed from the painting's description, and this was replaced with subtle inferences that were left in its place. And then after researching, I discovered that it's not only possible that the artist William Rankin was gay, but that the donator, who was his sister, possibly was as well. She seemed to have some connections as well. But what it showed was that there's a high burden of proof needed to feel comfortable even suggesting an LGBT connection. And tentative language and suggestion, they are acceptable, but we do need to be more comfortable in not having a definitive answer for these stories, as history, has made this nearly impossible with the lack of surviving evidence. So overall, this placement encouraged confidence in selecting stories, and that empathy and queer feeling are valid and useful starting points as part of the research process. And connections and community outside the castle walls also encouraged me to find the queer stories within as well. So finally, this presentation has demonstrated that to find objects and stories of queer significance, effective encounter and expansion of the castle boundaries can be used as a starting point. When presenting these stories, marginalised narratives should be free and offered as part of the ticket of the site, and we should discourage these stories from being viewed as supplementary and instead see them as integral to these multi-layered narratives. Creative practice offers a solution to stories which are ephemeral and lack evidence, and when hosting these narratives, consider how permanency these are, to be able to safeguard these stories for the future, like that with souls. Finally, kind of authorial personal identity is important. So I know Karen Dempsey has touched on the demographics of even within castle studies and like authors and scholars. There's very few open LGBT people within the field. And I don't really see anybody else publishing on LGBT stories within this. And Emily Robinson does indicate as well that historians choose a topic which resonates. So my advice is to encourage the next generation of researchers to kind of use their personal identity in their work and have the confidence to explore objects of queer significance. So here's my contact information if you need, because I'll be leaving NTU soon. That's the email I'll be using going forward. I will have a website forthcoming as well, where I can do talks. I've been hired by English Heritage and kind of Nottingham Castle Pride in the past to speak on queer stories. And if you want to see me present more on castles, I will be at IMC Leeds in early July on the Tuesday and the Thursday as well. Thank you.